Hello and welcome to the National Press Theater. My name is Rachel Haynes and I'll be moderating today's press conference. Before we begin, I just want to go over a few safety measures that we have in place to protect the health and safety of our interpreters. If you are going to use the earpieces in front of you, please make sure that when you're not using it, you keep it as far away from the microphone as possible, and you'll see little stickers in front of you, so to please place it face down there on the middle of the sticker to make sure that we reduce any audio feedback for our interpreters. So welcome to today's press conference. Today we have the members of the Senate Committee on Indigenous Peoples who will be holding a press conference following the release of their report. With us we have the chair of the committee, Senator Brian Francis, Deputy Chair of the committee, Senator David Arnot, and Senator Michèle Audette. Following the senator's remarks, we will have a question and answer period. We will start in the room for any questions, and then we will move online. And with that, I will hand it over to our senators.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming to the press conference for our report titled Respected and Protected Towards the Establishment of an Indigenous Human Rights Framework. Nina Dalusi and Brian Francis. My name is Brian Francis. I represent Epigwet, or Prince Edward Island, in the Senate, and I am the chair of the Senate Committee on Indigenous Peoples. With me is the committee's deputy chair, Senator Arnot, and Senator Michèle Audette, whose past work as a commissioner of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls is instrumental as to why we're all here today. The central recommendation of our report is for the creation of 2 new institutions created by and for Indigenous peoples. The establishment of an Indigenous Human Rights Ombudsperson and an Indigenous Human Rights Tribunal would represent a significant step towards increasing federal accountability for the protection and promotion of the rights of Indigenous peoples. One reason why an Indigenous Human Rights Ombudsperson and Tribunal is necessary is the fact that there are no available remedies in the federal human rights system to address situations where the collective rights of Indigenous peoples, including economic, social, and cultural rights, are violated. A human rights system that does not understand, enforce, and protect rights that are essential to the survival, dignity, and well-being of our communities is simply not enough. As one witness told us, other rights have very little meaning without respect for fundamental rights, like the right to an adequate standard of living, including adequate food and housing. You may well ask if the powers of the Canadian Human Rights Commission and the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal could simply be adapted without needing a separate Indigenous human rights mechanism. It is true that Indigenous peoples have secured important victories at the Commission and Tribunal despite high costs and other significant barriers. For example, in 2016, the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal issued a landmark ruling that substantiated a complaint of racial discrimination against First Nations children living on reserve and in the Yukon through the systemic underfunding of child welfare and other essential services. But even then, the Tribunal has issued multiple non-compliance orders due to the failure of the federal government to address and prevent human rights violations, and the case is still unresolved. This brings us to a second point. The effectiveness of the current federal human rights system is hindered by long delays. We heard how this negatively affects Indigenous people as they may continue to face discrimination while waiting for resolution. So while useful, the Canadian Human Rights Commission and Tribunal are clearly not completely responsive to the needs of Indigenous people. That's also because on a fundamental level, the Commission and the Tribunal are not designed for Indigenous people. An Indigenous Ombudsperson and Human Rights Tribunal grounded in Indigenous knowledge, practices, and traditions, such as mediation and other forms of dispute resolution, would be better suited to bring justice to people and communities where it has been in short supply. These new human rights institutions would also be consistent with our right to self-determination and would provide a more culturally responsive and trauma-informed environment for Indigenous people to feel safe enough to share experiences that can be painful. The proposal for a new Indigenous human rights mechanism is gaining momentum. The final report of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, released in 2019, included 231 calls for justice that were characterized as legal imperatives. Call for Justice 1.7 for the establishment of a National Indigenous and Human Rights Ombudsperson and a National Indigenous Human Rights Tribunal. The federal government appears to be listening. In January 2023, it organized a national roundtable of Indigenous leaders and federal, provincial, and territorial ministers. There, the government announced the appointment of a ministerial special representative, Jennifer Moore-Rattray, to provide advice and recommendations on the implementation of Calls for Justice 1.7. When the representative testified before a committee in April 2023, she reiterated the urgent need for an Indigenous human rights mechanism. Our existing mechanisms are limited in understanding, enforcement, and protection of Indigenous rights, she said. There is no simple, fast, free way for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples to address violations of Indigenous human rights or treaty rights. This void must be addressed. But this will only happen if the new Indigenous human rights mechanism is given real powers to bring about transformative change. It must have the power to make legally binding decisions, to conduct investigations, and to report on systemic issues. And it must have the power to hold the government accountable for actions that violate the rights of Indigenous people. Should Canada become the first country to establish a National Indigenous Human Rights Ombudsperson and Tribunal, our country will be a leader in advancing reconciliation. Before I conclude, I want to acknowledge all Indigenous women, girls, Two-Spirit, and gender-diverse people who have gone missing and had their lives taken too soon or continue to experience violence. I also recognize the tireless efforts of the families and communities to end this national crisis rooted in systemic violations and abuses of human rights. The establishment of a National Indigenous Human Rights Ombudsperson and Tribunal is essential to confronting and preventing these injustices and to advance healing and justice for all. For our part, our committee will continue to remind government of its obligations in the hope that it will take the action necessary to respect and protect Indigenous human rights. Well, Alan, thank you. Now I'll pass it over to Senator Arnot for a few words.
Thank you, Senator Francis. The key recommendation of our report is for the establishment of an Indigenous Human Rights Ombudsman and an Indigenous Human Rights Tribunal. Recognizing that change of this magnitude can take time, our committee also considered whether changes to the existing human rights mechanisms in Canada could be beneficial. In our view, they are well worth looking at. The Canadian Human Rights Commission and the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal are Canada's main federal human rights bodies. The Commission can investigate human rights complaints and refer cases to the Tribunal. The Tribunal hears evidence, decides whether discrimination has occurred, and can even award remedies. Cindy Blackstock, the Executive Director of the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society of Canada, provided us with some fascinating insights into the current process. As Senator Francis noted, she was successful in achieving a significant ruling in favor of First Nations children in a case brought before the Tribunal. In her testimony to our committee, she raised concerns about insufficient sanctions for respondents who don't comply with the Tribunal's orders. In her case, Canadian federal government. As she told us, the Tribunal substantiated the complaint after 72 days of trial and ordered the government to stop its discriminatory practices. But the government didn't, and Dr. Blackstock noted that 20 more non-compliance orders followed. That's a huge problem. She also took issue with the cap on the compensation for pain and suffering that the Tribunal is permitted to award, which is $20,000. It's a number that's out of step with the current reality, and that was set back in 1998. It needs to be refreshed and improved. While this is not a trivial amount of money, it is not a deterrent to a deep-pocketed respondent. As Dr. Blackstock told our committee, when you're dealing with someone for whom money is not much of an object, there should be an additional sanction available that are in keeping with the size and quality of the breach. Our committee is sympathetic to this view and recommends that the federal government explore the need to increase that cap as soon as possible. Indigenous people must face, or also face, barriers when accessing Canada's human rights mechanisms. For example, a Director General at the Human Rights Commission told the committee that costs awards are precluded by the Canadian Human Rights Act. That means even successful litigants can't get their legal fees covered. As a result, many would-be litigants can find themselves unable to make a complaint unless they have considerable means or can find counsel willing to do so for pro bono work. That's why we're recommending that the Canadian Human Rights Commission, in partnership with Indigenous peoples, undertake a broad consultations process to identify the barriers that prevent Indigenous people from bringing complaints to the Commission. We would also like to see the Commission develop an Indigenous-led strategy that is culturally responsive and inclusive to remove those barriers. We recommend that the Commission provide our committee with a progress report twice a year commencing in June of 2025. In addition, delays in hearing cases could be resolved by ensuring that the Commission and the Tribunal are adequately funded. After all, justice delayed is justice denied. Delays do represent another barrier to Indigenous litigants and indeed anyone making a human rights complaint in Canada. It is clear to us and to the witnesses who generously provided us with their experience and expertise that change is needed now. Canada's existing human rights mechanisms do not work for everyone. We've seen compelling evidence that a human rights mechanism for Indigenous peoples, by Indigenous peoples, is ultimately the best solution to ensure that Indigenous human rights are respected and protected. But as the hard work to build this new structure continues, we cannot lose sight of the possibility of effecting meaningful change in Canada's existing human rights mechanisms. We therefore urge the federal government to act on the recommendations in this report to improve the current human rights regime. This would help protect the human rights of Indigenous peoples and of all Canadians. Thank you, and Senator Audette will now speak.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much. Nojamam. Merci. Je vais faire cette partie-là en français le temps que mes collègues mettent leurs petites oreillettes. Et while you're putting your earpiece, I just want to say thank you so much, Senator Arnot, Senator Francis, my chief. I say all the time in my language that you're giving life to something that was very hard for families. Thank you. So, you can see, c'est avec beaucoup d'émotion. Bon, je reviens en français. Pour commencer mon message, je vais le donner à Birdie, Mélanie, Denise et toutes les familles qui ont participé à l'enquête nationale. Je vous dis un gros merci. Lorsque j'ai été nommée sénatrice, c'est un jour important, mais c'était aussi une façon de poursuivre le travail de l'enquête nationale, entre autres. De faire en sorte que les appels à la justice soient honorés et surtout qu'on leur donne vie. Et voilà, des hommes, des sénateurs, des collègues m'ont interpellé pour me demander quelle serait l'approche la plus importante qu'on devrait prendre suite à cette grande enquête nationale. Les familles qui sont proches de moi m'ont dit 1,7, 1,10, non négociable. Ce sont les appels à la justice les plus importants dans un contexte de Parlement. Je leur dis merci. Vous avez fait le travail. Vous avez poursuivi ce travail-là important. Et toujours avec beaucoup d'émotion, mais aussi de conviction, le rapport va nous permettre de dire encore une fois au gouvernement fédéral et à ceux et celles qui suivent de près les travaux du Comité des affaires autochtones que la création d'un cadre juridique est quelque chose de fondamental, de nécessaire. Nous avons entendu plus de 46 témoins, des experts, des hommes, des femmes, des juristes, des gens du milieu académique. Et on parle bien d'une richesse autochtone qui est venue nous partager leur vision, leur réflexion à quoi devrait ressembler un mécanisme sur la défense des droits des personnes autochtones. Je leur dis merci à toutes ces personnes-là. 8 recommandations vont ressortir de ce rapport important. Toujours avec une optique de promouvoir, observer, protéger et faire respecter les droits des personnes autochtones. Je le dis et je le répète tant et aussi longtemps que j'ai de l'oxygène dans mes poumons, la reddition de comptes, la transparence. Tout ça, pour moi, sont des choses, des valeurs et des principes importants. Si les provinces ont des commissions de droits de la personne ou des mécanismes de protection des droits pour les citoyens et citoyennes, nous sommes rendus à une étape où il est clair pour nous, les peuples autochtones, que nous avons aussi ce droit-là, qui va aussi nourrir le droit à l'autodétermination et surtout amener des solutions autochtones. Alors, vous allez, j'espère, prendre connaissance de ce rapport, de poursuivre avec nous et d'encourager, en tout cas pour ma part, je ne lâcherai pas prise sur les recommandations où on demande au gouvernement fédéral, à certains ministères bien précis, au ministère de la Couronne, de jouer, de respecter ou de faire son rôle de coordination au sein du gouvernement fédéral sur comment on doit honorer les appels à la justice, mais aussi les recommandations de ce rapport. So in English, I say thank you to my colleagues for the work you did.
Thank you so much. We'll move over to our question period. We'll start in the room with Fraser from APTN.
Yeah, I was wondering about if you could be a bit more specific on how you think this person should be appointed and the term, and appointed by who.
I'll start it off. I guess those are types of things that will be worked out as we move forward. The important thing is now is that we start with the idea of a national Indigenous Human Rights Tribunal and an ombudsperson, and preferably appointed by or with input from our First Nations people, because that's what it's all about.
And just as a follow-up, you mentioned a couple times child welfare funding and some of the disputes over that, and I have, followed the tribunal as well. And one of the things that's come up from organizations like the Assembly of First Nations is that they would prefer that elected representatives, the chiefs, make these types of decisions rather than a board or even the tribunal, and that this. They think that the decisions and some of the things they've signed with the federal government are the best process to do that rather than having outside boards or interference in that way. So I'm just wondering how you would balance that, or a tribunal or ombudsperson would balance that.
If I can,
Yeah.
if I can say two things. The first one, the report will support the work of the je sais pas c'est quoi son titre en anglais, là, Jennifer Moore-Rattray, when she was appointed by the minister, where she is proposing a framework, a legal framework, a piece of what could look the legislation that Canada should push or advance, and how we choose the person. But as a former commissioner, but also as a Innu woman and a senator, for me, it's very important that we find a balance, yes, between our First Nation government, but also grassroots people. If we had a national inquiry, it's because grassroots people stood up and supported by many chiefs in Canada. So the balance is very important, that we have also a space, safe space, where the people have a say in those structures.
Thank you. We will move online right now. We have Alessia from the Canadian Press with one question and one follow-up.
Hi there. Good morning. A little bit off topic from what we're talking about here today, but hoping to get your comments on how the Liberals tried to bring the First Nations Clean Water Bill to the Senate last week. They gathered First Nations leaders in the House to witness it, but they say the Conservatives blocked it and are playing politics with an essential right. I'd like your responses on what happened there.
Well, I'll start it off by saying we're here to talk about the the tribunal and the ombudsperson today.
You can call the offices after, but in respect of family members, I think we should pursue on this.
Well, on this then, regarding the tribunal, Canada went to the CHRT yesterday saying that they won't be able, they won't be able to meet the deadline to address the Jordan's Principle backlog. Your comments on that?
I'll take that, Dave. I'll take that.
I don't really want to comment on that. Jordan's Principle is really important. It's making a big difference in provinces. And I know I can speak in Saskatchewan, and I know in Saskatoon it's a huge difference that needs to be properly funded. And that's as clear as I can get.
Or you're helping us to have a strong argument that when we will have those mechanisms in place, we will have an opportunity or a place or a space to make sure that we never stop or push to make sure that families in the communities or in the urban area are respected in their rights, according also on the Jordan's Principle, and I would add Joyce Echaquan Principle also.
And I think moving forward, it's fair to say that there's certainly a lot of work to do, but it's important that we continue to move the needle forward, which I think we're doing here with our report and holding the government accountable.
Thank you. We don't have any other questions on Zoom right now. I will turn it back to the floor. Fraser, if you have another question.
Yeah, I was just going to follow up that as well. I know you don't want to get into specifics, but Canada already does have a number of, for example, the correctional investigator, different bodies that monitor the government. The problem is the government often doesn't follow the recommendations, and there's been numerous Canadian Human Rights Tribunal rulings, court rulings against Canada on Indigenous issues that they have not followed. I wonder how this person, rather than making recommendations or monitoring, might improve things for Indigenous people, I guess, on the ground, so the government actually follows some of these rulings.
Well, I think if we have, the Human Rights Ombudsperson and Tribunal that are created by First Nations, for First Nations, that are culturally appropriate, trauma-informed, and, like as I mentioned, led by First Nations or Indigenous people, that will go a long way.
Do you have a follow-up, Fraser?
No, that's
Okay, perfect. Right now, we don't have any other questions on Zoom. And with that, I will end the press conference. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks.